Hi, and welcome to Conscious Planning, where we interrogate, realign, and envision planning. And I'm your host, Nhlala Shibabu. Welcome back to episode 4. In this episode, we're going to be realigning and possibly envisioning planning. And by this, I mean I will be sharing my thoughts and my views after my conversation with Professor Mfaniseni Sihlongonyane. And really highlighting important aspects after my conversation that I feel are truly important in assisting me in answering my main research question. In the last episode, I fully explored the role of positionality and the importance of that in our role as planners and planning in this complex African landscape that is filled with so many nuances. I think this is the point in the episode where I have to admit and confess that I think that advocacy planning is for me, that is the point in which or rather the space where I identify as a planner. And I say this because I find that for me, I place a lot of value in the dignity of people. And by this, I mean every day when we switch on the news, we see a lot of media reporting about children having to walk long distances to school and having to cross a river because there's no bridge, there's no infrastructure. Or there being an outbreak of cholera because water stations are not being maintained. And so for me, I find that all of these things have an impact on the dignity of people, the way people live. In the book Migrant Labor After Apartheid, The Inside Story, by Leslie Bank, Dorit Posel, and Francis Wilson, in one of their chapters, they highlight the reason why there's so much migration and the fact that people move from the rural areas to the urban areas in hopes of maybe increasing their quality of life because services are much better in the urban areas. And so this, for me, means that there is a gap that planners, policymakers, politicians are not getting to. And so I personally am of the belief that in our capacity as planners, we have the power and the influence to amplify the voices of the marginalized and to truly understand their experiences and find ways in which, in our capacity as planners, we can alleviate some of the challenges that they face. And in our attempt of trying to alleviate these challenges and possibly increase people's quality of life in any way that we can, as Prospana mentioned, it's important that we interrogate and question the frameworks to really ask if it's inclusive of people and of the experiences and the manner in which they relate to space, to society, and to people. And in what ways can we assist in helping that important aspect? And I think a very important point goes back to well-being. The tool of well-being being a tool that we as planners use to amplify people's experience. Smith highlights the challenges that people face in African countries, and he goes on to say that some of the challenges is food security, access to employment opportunities, infrastructure, and all of this is a result of insufficient urban governance, right? And so whilst argues that urban governance and policy are essential and important tools that can be used to ensure that these challenges are curbed. It is in these instances that our role as planners is further amplified to say that it is in our position, or in our positionality rather, as planners, where we advance certain interests for certain people. And so, if we were to say that as planners, we use our voices and our positions of influence to say that we are going to advocate for the marginalized, we are then using our voices to ensure that we find ways in which we can alleviate some of these challenges in the manner that we best see fit. And I think a very big part of this, to build on to planners using their voices, is to say that we cannot say that we are going to plan for people but not ensure their well-being and not ensure their expression, their freedom of expression. And by well-being, I'm referring to the notion of well-being as a holistic approach that ensures that people are given all the tools that will maximize or allow them to use all their capabilities to alleviate their challenges. This is an aspect that Wild highlights to say that if we're going to ensure that the development of African people is holistic, by this we mean ensuring that people have access to education, employment, skills development, social relations such as security and insecurity, and to really ensure that people's inequalities and the manner in which they relate to the state is understood. Because I think for me, my biggest fear is that if we are contracted to go and develop in these rural areas where we have to learn to deal and understand the experiences of the people, the importance of traditional authorities, and the things that they value in their communities. We as planners have to then reposition ourselves to be in a space where we are open to hearing, understanding, receiving, and possibly internalizing these experiences to really ensure that we highlight and plan these spaces in a manner which is inclusive to them. And this is an important part that is linked to expression. If these spaces are not planned in a manner which is inclusive to them, the end result then becomes that people no longer feel like they belong to this area. People then no longer feel that they're connected and they are given the freedom to fully express themselves in whatever capacity, be that culturally, be that spiritually, whatever it looks like. We need to ensure that we're able to say that this is a space where you're allowed to conduct yourself and express yourself in any manner that you see fit without there being any frameworks or policies that limit that experience. If one is to reflect back on the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein, in her book, she highlights the fact that the use of erasing and then reconstructing is a very important element that has been used by scientists when they were experimenting on people to say that we can erase all your characteristics that make you you. Whether that means you're suffering from depression or anxiety. Dr. Herb, the psychology professor who happened to be a pioneer of sensory deprivation, aimed to test whether or not it's possible to erase one's faults and rewrite, one's personality from scratch with better personality traits. So if you have anxiety, we can then erase all those characteristics and rewrite them with better, calmer characteristics, for example. And so when this concept of erase and reconstruct was then adopted and applied in terms of policy, we then find, especially under the Nixon presidency and administration, we then find that there's this notion that we can apply certain policy strategies and economic strategies to really ensure that you then erase existing economies and existing institutions, political institutions, and reconstruct them to be those that are pro-democracy and protect the interests of the US. And so if we were to bring that concept back into planning, it can be argued that, as Prof. Bana mentioned, the Western perspective does not accommodate for Black people's experiences. And so what this means is that we then have spaces where, when we are contracted to go and develop a certain area, our initial standpoint might be to erase the entire area and erase the footprint and characteristics that contribute to the localism of the space. And so it is in these elements where I personally feel that we then need to reconsider or reimagine what developed looks like, what urban looks like. Because the last thing that we'd want to do is to erase and reconstruct elements that make part of people's everyday experiences, that make part of people's cultures and traditions. And then we end up with a space that excludes people and, in effect, impacts people's well-being in terms of what works for them and aspects that help them to ensure that they're able to participate in society and economy to the best of their abilities. And so it can be argued that in this space, these are the elements where we can say that the role of traditional authorities in this modern landscape is highly important to ensure that they come to the table and protect the interests of their communities, but also that as planners, we reimagine our position to ensure that we are functioning from a space of inclusivity, from a space of respect, as Feinstein argued. And so, essentially, as planners, we then need to decide whether or not we are for the modernist planning approach, which is very much highlighted and based in capitalist values, or if we are going to be radical, as Prof. Bana says, and reposition ourselves to advocate for the marginalized, to question the systems and the frameworks that we have, to say, are they fully equitable? And do they apply to the Splumer planning principles, which is to ensure that spatial planning and land use management system promotes social and economic inclusion, as well as provision for development principles and norms and provisions for a stable and efficient use of land, and redress the imbalance of the past, ensuring of the equitable application of spatial development planning and land use management systems. And this is the point where Prof. Bana was saying that, does our planning framework really ensure the right to the city for the people? Smith highlights that in African countries, there is a real problem of urban agriculture being in the urban areas, and this is highlighted as a problem because it doesn't fit into the modernist ideals of what the governments, aim to implement. And so it is in these points where we need to then say, but do land use planning management systems really benefit the poor? Because in this instance, it doesn't, especially in countries where there's a lot of urban poverty. And this is actually a point that Smith highlights to say that urban agriculture can actually be used as a means to alleviate urban poverty, but because it doesn't fit into the modernist planning approach, it is then discarded, which results in there being more urban poverty in urban areas. In the book Plan for People, Not for Profit by Schmidt, he then highlights that Lefeu's arguments and ideas of the right to the city highlight the fact that people should not feel displaced in a space, and that the displacement of people is a result of space being designed to discriminate against people and exclude them. He then further highlights that there needs to be a balance between managing and cultivating a society that has the freedom of expression to each person, but also the appropriateness of space in the manner in which it is beneficial to them. So if we plan for spaces for profit and not for people, we then end up in a situation where we are not only shocking people's everyday experiences, but also discriminating and limiting people's localism, which eventually has an impact on the way in which people express themselves, the manner in which people relate to space, relate to people, but also affects people's well-beings in that space. And this takes us back to the crucial point of being radical, of questioning the system and frameworks which we use to plan for spaces, but also then questioning our positionality as planners to say, who and why do we plan, and what are our objectives? What are we trying to achieve in planning these spaces, and for whom? Whom does it benefit at the end of the day? And like I highlighted towards the end in our previous episode, the reality is that we do live in a capitalist society. And so trying to manage the two between planning for people and not for profit is a very difficult thing to balance in this current space. And this then speaks to the name of my podcast, which is Conscious Planning, where we as planners need to find ourselves in spaces where we're able to interrogate and then realign and then envision what planning looks like in this complex landscape. What that looks like in terms of being able to balance the capitalist society that we live in and using our influence as a voice for the marginalized. Essentially, I would argue, depends on you, me as planners to say, well, where do we position ourselves and what is our stance? And so in closing, to answer the research question, the role of traditional authorities is a very complex one. It is one that has been existing for many, many years before colonialization, and essentially is an integral part of communities in the post-independent era. And so part of their responsibilities is to really ensure and protect the Bill of Rights, and by that I mean to promote democratic governance, to promote social and economic development, to promote gender equality, but also they also have then the responsibility to protect their communities, to ensure that their communities are also able to participate in this new developed society that we find ourselves in, where there is a cash economy. And so it is then part of the traditional authorities' responsibility to work with local municipalities to fully ensure that they're able to provide their communities with the skills and the environment and the tools that they need to fully achieve all their capabilities, to ensure that their communities are in a state of well-being where they're fully able to express themselves. And this leads me to the second part of my question, which is what are the tools that us as planners need to employ or have to really ensure that we're able to plan in this complex and dynamic landscape. I think the first that we've highlighted is to understand the context in which we plan, and Feinstein really does argue for this. And the second point being that we are able to then identify our positionality and the impact that that has on our intelligence as planners, to question our intelligence and to question whether or not the systems that we're using actually applies and protects the people that we're planning for. And the third being that we are then placed in a position of influence, which means that we can then use our voices to really advocate for those who have been marginalized. And I think the fourth one would have to be ensuring that in all that we do, we're able to protect and advocate for people's expression and well-being. And if we can do that, then possibly we can then plan for more socially inclusive spaces that do adhere to Bloom's principles. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time to sit down and spend time with me whilst I explore all these complex, nuanced matters that we face in this developing landscape that we find ourselves in, and really going on a journey with me to try and identify our role as planners, the role of traditional authorities, and the tools that we need to really ensure that we are equipped with as planners to plan for this complex landscape appropriately. I truly appreciate it. Thank you for listening in. I am your host, Nhlala Shivambu, and this is Conscious Planning.